Welcome to episode 463. This week, we're joined by Tyler Huckabee, but he's not here just to talk about the news. Phil wants to grill him about his recent article about VeggieTales, in which Huckabee accuses Phil's mom of tricking him into creating vegetable characters that are beyond God's salvation. And in an unexpected twist, the confrontation becomes a therapy session for Tyler. Also this week, over 1,000 crew staff members say that the parachurch's focus on diversity and racism has resulted in mission drift. Are they right? Or is it just another example of Christians getting paranoid about CRT? Then I interviewed D. Michael Lindsay, the recent president of Gordon College and the new president of Taylor University, about his new book, Hinge Moments, Making the Most of Life's Transitions. We talk about his research about the best ways to navigate changes in life, how we think about God's will, perhaps incorrectly, and the unique challenges facing a younger generation today who are facing adulthood very differently. All that, plus an update on my recent cross-country road trip. But first, I want to make you aware of a special series we've just launched called Jesus and John Wayne with Dr. Kristen Kobes-Dumais, the author of a best-selling book by that same title. I spent 4 hours with Dr. Dumais talking about her book and the way it helps explain where the evangelical movement has been, where it is today, and even where it may be going into the future. It's a fascinating and enlightening look at evangelicalism and perhaps explains many of your own experiences in the faith. The special podcast series is in 4 parts, and we're releasing a new episode every Friday. But if you're a Patreon supporter of The Holy Post, you get to listen to each episode a week early. It's our way of saying thank you to our patrons who make The Holy Post possible. If you've not yet become a Patreon supporter of our show, we encourage you to go to holypost.com and click the Support Us button at the top of the page. You can get access to bonus material from the guests that we interview, merchandise, and a monthly live stream with me, Phil, and Christian where you can ask us questions live. Plus, you get early access to great specials like the Jesus and John Wayne series. Thanks again to all of our patrons, and now on with the show.
Hey there, this is Phil. Welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. I'm here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
And Christian Taylor. Hi, Christian.
Hey there, Phil.
And we have a special guest. If you're watching the video, you can see that we have it's not Jason, it's not Caitlin. Who is it? We don't know. We're going to meet him in a second. But first, we have to ask a couple of questions. Skye just got back from driving in a 2-seat convertible from Southern California to Chicago with his son in the sidecar. Did he fit inside the Miata with you, or did you have to have a sidecar connected to it?
I am still larger than my son. So
Okay.
For now, I'm the bigger problem in that car.
Okay. And were you a big problem in that car?
No, I just fit. I'm about 5'10", 5'11", but if you're over 6 feet, you don't fit in that car.
Yeah, you have a Miata problem. So Was it
Yes.
fun? Was
It was a great time. Yeah, we had a really great time.
Highlights of the trip?
Highlights, we went to the Grand Canyon. I'd never been to the Grand Canyon.
Wow.
That was fun.
And you didn't fall in taking a selfie?
No, I was actually super paranoid about that because I got nervous watching other people go off onto those ledges and those rocks are slippery.
Turn their back to the great drop and then look up and try to get a good framing of themselves as they go over the edge.
Many of our listeners have been there, but it's one of those things when you see it for the first time, it just doesn't look real.
Yeah.
It looks like a painting.
Right.
So that was really cool. We went to Las Vegas. That was fun. But one of the highlights was every night, Isaac is a big movie fan. So we had a deal that we were going to watch a different movie every night together. And it had to be a movie he hadn't seen before. And so we got on the theme of watching mobster movies. So we watched Casino and Godfather Parts 1 and 2.
Because you started out in Vegas? Is that why?
Partly.
Okay.
But I've been talking to him about the Godfather movies forever and finally convinced him to watch them. And then we listened to podcasts in the car while we were driving about the Godfather. So we had like this deep dive into the brilliance of the Godfather movies, except for part 3, which is trash. But
it wasn't that Godfather 3D when the shark was in 3D.
Right.
I can't remember. Okay.
Uh-huh.
I don't remember that. Okay. So it was fun.
It was good. Yeah, we had a great time.
And the most boring stretch of the drive?
Probably North Texas is pretty boring, except for the Cadillac Ranch, which was nice. I really like driving through the desert. Like Arizona, New Mexico is really cool.
Okay.
North Texas was pretty boring. Oklahoma was pretty boring.
What percentage of the time did you have the top down?
Oh, none.
Oh, really?
On the highway, none. No, and it's a hard top. It's a
Yeah.
hardtop convertible, thankfully. It's still loud in there, but
Yeah.
it was way too hot to have the top down. In fact,
Okay.
when we were going through the Mojave Desert, the temperature got up to about 108, and that was the first drive I'd done in this car, like at any distance.
Yeah.
So I was like looking at my gauges,
Right.
waiting for something to break, waiting for something to
Right.
go wrong on this thing. But it did great.
Okay. And you did this because you've always wanted a Miata and you've been tracking one for a while and you
Well, I
found
had one. I had
just
one 20 years ago
yeah.
before we had
So this is
children.
this is your midlife crisis.
Yeah. I
This
had
is
one
your
20 years
midlife
ago.
crisis.
I had to get rid of it because, kids. And then I found a used one when I was out in California about 6 weeks ago that was in great shape with no rust because it's Southern California.
Sure.
So I bought it and left it at a friend's house in California. And then Isaac and I flew out and got it and
Drove
drove
it
it
back.
back. Yeah.
That's exciting.
It's a good father-son time. And I've
I
been teaching him to drive stick the whole way. So that was
would
part of it.
he ever want to do that again? Or is that like reading, War and Peace? It's like, that was a really valuable experience, Dad, but I never want to do that again.
He didn't say that. I mean, I don't know if either of us ever
Didn't
have
say
to do it
that.
again.
Did he have that look on his face?
No. We had a good time.
Okay.
I don't know if I don't know if I would ever want to do it again. It's not like something you want to do. I'd much
Right.
rather fly, but
Right.
it was a good experience.
Okay, fantastic. Glad you made it back alive. I tweeted at one point that I figured you were somewhere in a jail in Las Vegas or in Nevada generally. Because, every good road trip movie, at some point, you're in jail in Nevada, right?
Well, thankfully not this time.
All right. I'm a little disappointed, but that's okay. You can tell us the real story of what happened later on. I imagine. Here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. And Christian Taylor, what's up?
Not much. What's up with you?
Have you started on your next movie?
I have. It's actually a documentary series called The Brave Dutch.
The Brave Dutch, and that was a famous teapot. What was the Brave Dutch? It was a race car. It was a
So the Brave Dutch is a group of people that ran the Dutch Underground that saved a lot of American, British, Canadian, downed American pilots, as well as a lot of Jews. Many people know about Corrie ten Boom. And
she was a brave Dutch.
Wouldn't they be
and
the Dutch underwater instead of the Dutch
Oh,
underground?
Skye, that's
I
good.
can't imagine you dig very deep
do
in
you know
Holland.
they
That's
named
good.
did you ever hear about the Underwater Boys?
No.
So the Underwater Boys were the boys that were 16, 17, 18 in Holland at the time. And the Germans would take those boys and send them to Germany to be, their workforce. And so the brave Dutch were so accustomed at this point to hiding a lot of their Jewish friends. They began hiding their sons as well. And
Oh,
then when airmen kept being shot down over Holland, they just would hide them also. So they were very, very brave, strong people, and their network that they established was incredibly complex and not very well known to a lot of Americans. And one of my dear family friends was shot down over Holland, and he was kept alive for 15 months by a group of Dutch resistance workers who finally helped him get back behind Allied lines. And when he got to Paris, he wrote an homage to thank them and to tell everything that they had done to keep him and the others alive. So I hope to tell that story. We did sign a deal
wow.
last week with Virgil Films, and they're going to help us pitch that to all the big streamers and hopefully, find us the funds we need up front to tell it. So we'll see. Meanwhile, I'm still trying to sell The Girl Who Wore Freedom.
That sounds fun. Right. Girl Who Wore Freedom, now available on iTunes and where else? Amazon? Is it on
Apple TV.
Amazon Prime?
And you can write me to get a
Apple TV?
DVD.
I have to write to you to get a DVD? I can't go to a website and just order one?
Not yet. You have to get a private link to order it.
Wow.
It's very exclusive. We wouldn't want too many people to be able to get a hold of your film. That sounds like a fantastic idea. Okay, who's the new guy? The new guy is Tyler Huckabee. He is the King editor. Is that your title? King
Yeah,
editor?
I like it. Let's go with that. I'm not
From
gonna fact check that one.
Now you were from Relevant Magazine, but then
That's right.
there isn't really a magazine, so it's just Relevant what?
It's relevant. There's
a digital magazine.
We're pioneering the digital magazine format. This
Okay.
is our experiment to see if we can take the magazine into
So who do you
yeah.
Who do you say you work for? Relevant.
I say I work for Relevant. Relevant Media
Period.
Group is like the full company name, Relevant Media Group, but that predated. That goes way back before my time.
Oh yeah, way back.
So now there's there's the YouTube channel and the podcast and the TikTok, all the social media stuff that they don't let me around those controls. And I think that's the way we
that'd
like
be bad. That'd be bad.
But there is a magazine. It's just not a magazine you can hold yet. Although I guess
like
I
the
would be
magazine.
remiss if I did not mention that we are doing our first ever annual release, which will be an actual print, it'll be beautiful, like a coffee table book. You'll want to put it,
Ooh.
you want to get it out, you want to bring Christmas time, everybody gathers around, you're all going to get around the Relevant annual and flip through it, and you'll see
Okay.
all of our work for the year.
Well, I have to say, Tyler, and this is the reason you're on the show, that over the last, how long have you been writing for Relevant?
Well, let's see. I'm on my second tour, sort of. I got hired there not too long after I graduated from college. Worked there for a few years, and then left there around 2012, and then came back about 2 years ago to be senior editor.
Yeah, I think we started noticing some of your pieces over the last 2 years, and there were some good pieces. And we thought, hey, this guy, he seems to know what he's talking about. He has interesting things to say. But now you've ruined all that. Everything, all the goodwill that you had, you built up so much respect, so much goodwill. You took it, you flushed it down the toilet because you said things about my mother. If there's any rule of journalism, it's like, don't talk about other people's mothers.
Leave family out of it.
Yeah, leave family out of it. So, okay, so we talked about it on the podcast. You did a piece, Never Forget that VeggieTales couldn't show Jesus as a vegetable, or what was the name of the piece?
Yeah, you say it's kind of two-pronged, right? Can't be, if I remember correctly, can't show Jesus as a vegetable and could not have a salvific relationship.
Yes.
With vegetables.
Okay.
Yeah.
With Christ. Yeah, the vegetables cannot have salvific relationships with Jesus because why? Why, Skye, the theologian?
Because they're vegetables, Phil.
Hey, ding, 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 ding. You enterprise. Vegetables cannot have salvific relationships with Christ. And Tyler, I don't know, I guess it was, we accused him of using some hallucinogenic or psychedelic mushrooms or something. He says he didn't. He said he was just, I don't know, bored and wanted to, bring my mother into this.
Yeah, what was the genesis of that article?
I can peel back the curtain a little bit.
Okay,
we can go behind the scenes, and it's not overly complicated, and it's not an adventure, and there are no illegal drugs involved. But I had come across. I think I had heard this.
Not like
story.
You would admit if there were, right?
No,
so that's
sure I would.
That denial is meaningless.
All right. Well, I didn't.
You think the Strang Empire is going to smile on drug use? No.
I didn't need drugs for this one. How about that?
Okay.
Whether or not they were involved, they weren't necessary to the writing of it. I'd come across this factoid about VeggieTales before, and I was raised on VeggieTales. Watched a lot of VeggieTales when I was a kid.
In Nebraska, we learned before we started
I'm a Cornhusker. That's right. Yeah. And then came across this and found that sort of. It's unique in that I think that there were a lot of other, when I think about some of the other like Christian cartoon totems from that time, Salty the Singing Songbook predated VeggieTales by quite a bit. But you got Colby. To my knowledge, these characters, there was no reason to assume they weren't also like redeemed. This
songbook is
anthropomorphic
redeemed.
book. Yeah,
this Mr. Lion just gave his heart to Jesus.
Right. You assume that could be the case. So that stuck out to me about VeggieTales, and I started thinking about the why which Skye, you kind of launched into earlier. So then when I heard, and I know I should leave family out of it, but when I heard the origin story, which I believe you had confirmed kind of recently on Twitter, that this was your mother's idea or her request for the foundational parts of VeggieTales, I did throw that in there, and that did lead to some sort of hypothesize. I theorized some motives, both ulterior and otherwise, for why she
Yeah,
might have come up with that.
she was playing three-dimensional chess on my
Right.
young brain and trying to
Right.
get me to, and then I kind of lost your line of argument. Something about.
I thought it was a credit to her to try to force a like I'm a big fan of the White Stripes, who are a band here in town. And you'll see where I'm going with this. And Jack White, talks a lot about how he likes to make. He puts rules on his music to make it harder on himself. On stage, when he's playing live, he puts the instruments too far away, so it takes him longer to get there. He likes to play his guitars out of tune because then he has to work harder to make them sound right. So in my thinking, I was like, maybe your dear mother is pulling kind of a Jack White situation here, in that making it a little bit tougher for you in those early days, it actually ended up enriching the material with more theological heft. Which was the argument that I tried to put forth in that article, and I may not, and I'm willing to fall on this sword. I may not have done a very good job of it.
So let me get this straight. You're basically arguing that Phil's mother, who's a good friend of mine as well,
Okay.
Scotty, deliberately gave Phil a higher degree of difficulty in his VeggieTales.
She detuned my guitar.
Yeah, but purely for her son's own theological development, like to challenge him a little bit. Is that it?
I think that's
Okay, but,
if not
but
my line of argument, then at least a theory that I've got cooked up here.
Okay, but that assumes, and I have not talked to Scotty about this, but that assumes that there isn't actually anything inherently wrong with depicting Jesus as a vegetable or allowing vegetables to have a salvific relationship with him. Like, do you think it really would have been bad, Tyler, from your point of view? Do you think, looking back, having been raised on VeggieTales, would your faith have been somehow skewed or perverted if you had met a vegetable Jesus?
Now we're going. I guess, yeah. Like I said, we're falling down this rabbit hole. I do not. I think that my faith, as it stands now, would not be significantly different if I'd seen Jesus as a asparagus or a carrot. I don't think that would have thrown things off the. It wouldn't have made things worse than they are right now. Let's put it that way.
It's your
What about
own
Muhammad?
Vegetable Jesus. What about Muhammad? A vegetable Muhammad?
Yeah,
No,
Phil, you may
no,
not be
no,
with
no.
us if you had
No.
tried
Yeah,
that.
I know. Okay, so Tyler, you confused my mother. Someone sent her that story. She's
I do feel bad about that.
she's
That was not the goal. I
79,
don't want to distress anybody.
and I think she started to wonder, did I do that? Did I actually do that?
All right.
And she texted me and said, I don't know what to think about this. And I had to calm her down, say it's okay. The younger generation, the kids these days with their rock and roll and their existential angst, this is how it's manifesting itself in this young man. And
that's all fair, I think.
So I want to, on behalf of my mother, I needed to put you on the show so that I could give you the what for.
All right.
I'm
ready.
So I know why you did this. And I'm ready to lay it out because you're bitter. You're angry.
Oh,
you're an angry and bitter young man. And the reason you're bitter is that it's very clear that, well, your dad got to be the governor of Arkansas. Your sister got to be the White House press secretary.
Yeah.
And I had never heard of another Huckabee. I was like, okay, there's two Huckabees in the world, and they're both really prominent people. And then all of a sudden, here comes little brother, Tyler. Like, what's he going to do in the White House, or what's he going to be the governor of? And it's like, I'm just picturing, that Thanksgiving meal, Tyler, in the Huckabee home, where, dad's talking about what he's doing and sister's talking about what she's doing. And they're both getting invitations to Mar-a-Lago. And little Tyler says, well, I'm going to be a journalist, but kind of for the less conservative end of Christianity, and they say, all right, this was in Arkansas, I assume. So take your biscuits and gravy and you go eat at the kids' table, Tyler. You go to the kids' table, or better yet, you go out on the porch, eat out on the porch, and you were disowned.
I was hurt. Yeah.
Yeah, and you were here, and I understand. It's understandable that you would be hurt. That's a traumatic experience, and I also understand that you're probably going to tell me after this that you're not related to those Huckabees. You're a different Huckabee, and I understand the desire to want to say that. I understand that you want to tell me that Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who married Colonel Sanders and left the family for a chicken fortune, is not your sister. I understand that desire. I just don't think you need to lie about it anymore.
Okay. Well, first of all, I don't know if you've ever had the experience that I'm having right now of feeling just truly seen by somebody over a podcast, but
that's because we have video. If it was just audio,
but it's but this is a really, really vulnerable moment for me.
I know, but it's okay. It's okay.
Really powerful. This is free therapy.
You're in a safe place, Tyler. You're in a safe place.
I came in here to defend my take, and instead here I am disarmed, just wide open, and that feels really good. Actually, it hurts, but it feels really good.
Good.
And you're right that I'm not actually related to those Huckabees.
No, I'm right that you're going to.
But you're also right that that's not really relevant to those.
I'm not. I'm right that you're going to say that.
but
there are no other Huckabees, though. Have you ever heard, Skye? Have you ever heard of another Huckabee besides the two that everyone knows and this third one?
No, the closest I can think of is all those Hy-Vee grocery stores.
Hy-Vee?
Isn't that Hy-Vee? Hy-Vee.
Hy-Vee.
Sounds like
I grew up in Iowa. That's not Huckabee.
Well, it sounds like it.
There's not a lot of us, but there's not a lot of us. But there's a couple other Huckabees right here in Nashville.
Oh no!
Yeah.
Well, your dad's studio's in Nashville, right? He's doing a show from Nashville.
Yeah, that's true. He came here pretty recently. He's he's a transplant,
right?
But like you said, we don't talk. We're on the outs. Once I became part of the liberal media, then that was no more invites back home for biscuits and gravy at Thanksgiving.
So I think I feel like I can forgive you for stressing my mom out a little bit.
Well, I feel that. I do.
Of your own family issues. And it's okay. It's okay, Tyler. I don't think you're going to get the invitation to Mar-a-Lago. It's probably not going to happen. But it's okay. But seriously, why are you doing what you do? And because you've written a lot of really interesting stuff over the last 2 years.
Well, thank you.
You're poking some bears. I assume you've gotten some pushback. How's it going? And what do you make of the moment that the church is in right now? And what are you trying to accomplish with your writing?
Well, let's see. So I'll try to answer that in as briefly as possible. I think that what I'm trying to do with my work at Relevant is two things. I would hope that Relevant can be a place for people who don't feel a lot of acceptance within the Christian mainstream to feel like they can say things that may not be necessarily super welcome in that, and not necessarily Christian mainstream, but we'll say like sort of the narrow conservative mainstream within that very narrowly defined idea that is very popular, but is sometimes not as widespread as we tend to think it is. And then B, I hope that we can bring some moral clarity to some very complicated conversations that are happening. And I think a lot of times we tend to make our decisions based more on the tribe that we're in. And something that gives me a lot of satisfaction as a writer and an editor is when I can shift those tribal lines and add something that transcends those, that comes from a more moral place.
Do you get any pushback from the Relevant audience, or was the Relevant audience already kind of there when you started writing?
We do get pushback from. I think you're always going to get pushback. There's always going to be, but I think right at a point now where a lot of people can kind of they know what they've gotten themselves into, and they might disagree sometimes, and that's okay. And we can handle that. There was for us, like there were for many Christian institutions, a pretty big 2016 was very tough and was very complicated for us, and we are not partisan, and we did not take a side and did not put out a big, against Trump or for Hillary or anything like that, nor would we. We didn't do that in 2020 either, but it did our some of the things that we did publish about then candidate Trump did cost us quite a bit in terms of clicks and audience, and I think people were quite surprised that we were not more plainly on board with him than we were at the time.
Does that explain why you're all digital now?
Did we what?
Does that explain why you're all digital?
It's why. How does that change? COVID is why we're all digital now. But it did for sort of things had to change a little bit, and it's a complicated time for everybody, I think, who was trying to create Christian media content for a Christian audience at that time. It certainly was for us.
What's been your most popular piece that you've written?
Oh, the most popular thing that I've written. I don't know. It's probably something dumb. You put all this time and effort into the stuff that you think is really going to change the world. Your turn the world upside down for Jesus article, and then 12. I got something coming Wednesday. 12 rejected pitches for the dark, gritty live action Colby the Computer remake that we know is coming. And it'll just go gangbusters. People lap that stuff up. It's right, and they're fun to write too. I do enjoy it. It's a weird wheelhouse, but it's one that we can operate in quite well, and I enjoy that too. I think the most popular piece that I have written was probably back like during this would have been around the time of Michael Brown protests. When I wrote why Christians need to stop saying all lives matter.
Oh,
yeah, that's
stir one that still comes up a lot.
A response.
Yeah. So have you? Has anyone ever called you woke in not a complimentary way?
Yes, all the time.
That actually, I want to throw in a news story. I want to throw in one news story because it kind of fits what we're talking about. And that Campus Crusade for Christ is having a bit of an internal controversy. Crew, we're supposed to call it Crew now because that's right. What it's easier to tattoo on the back of your calf than Campus Crusade for Christ. Crew is divided over emphasis on race. Within the parachurch ministry, critics allege its recent approach to diversity has relied on critical race theory and resulted in mission drift. A group of at least 60 Crew staff members wrote a letter. Do you know how long the letter was that they wrote?
It's like 100 pages, wasn't it?
167 pages.
There you go.
Wrote a little letter.
That's a long letter.
It's not really a letter. 179. 179-page letter alleging an overemphasis on racial justice. That this overemphasis has exacerbated tensions that have been quietly brewing within the organization for years. So talking too much about racial justice is causing tension within the organization. We need to stop it and get back to what would we need to get back to? Guess, Tyler, what we need to get back to focusing on?
The gospel, evangelism.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
I can't believe talking about racial injustice is making some people uncomfortable.
It seems to be a kind of a common theme.
Usually it goes over so well.
It usually goes over so well. Yeah.
Krummas really botched it.
There was I just listened to an NPR interview about the move to, get critical race theory out of local school districts and all the heated school district meetings that are happening. There's a conservative group in Nevada that wants to require all teachers in Nevada to wear body cameras so that they can track whether they're teaching critical race theory in the classroom.
But they want teachers to also have guns.
Guns and body cameras.
Right. On that topic, I have this question. And I'm not
it has to be a question that Tyler has to answer. Okay.
I'm not an apologist for critical race theory. I think it can, there are problems with it and it can be used, problematically. Has anybody actually been harmed by CRT?
Tyler,
Is this
were
my?
you
I
were you
have not
harmed?
heard. I have not heard of any examples of people being CRT'd into the hospital or into or into like a or being radicalized to the point where like gas canisters I don't think that's how. But I
Like
think
that.
but I think that's part of the point, right? Is that you can take. Nobody knows what critical race theory means. It sounds kind of scary. It's 3 multisyllabic words, so that can mean anything. And then you can kind of say, well, see, that's critical race theory over there. Anytime something sort of extreme on that fight
But see,
happens,
I think
it's a
this explains,
boogeyman.
not to recap what you guys did last week when I was gone, but I think this explains partly why the Southern Baptists voted the way they did at their convention recently. Because the pirates, the ultra conservative wing of the SBC, tried to make critical race theory this boogeyman that was going to rally everybody to
Right. They
vote.
said the leadership of the denomination was never Trumpers and critical race theorists.
Right. So they're trying to raise the specter of critical race theory is going to come in and destroy our faith and destroy our families and destroy our schools and all that sort of stuff. And no doubt there, like I said, there are some things that are problematic about critical race theory. But I think the people who are at that SBC convention are typically really committed churchgoers, right? These are very committed people that end up attending this thing. And I think when they were presented with the option of the threat of critical race theory versus what they've actually experienced, which is a crazy number of people who've been sexually abused in churches, or the crazy number of people who've watched their kids walk away from their church as young adults because of politics and racism, when they look at the reality of who's actually been harmed versus this theoretical threat of critical race theory, in the end, the people who they actually know who've actually been harmed by sexual abuse and politics and racism in the church far outweighed the theoretical fear of CRT. And that's the thing I keep waiting for, is who's going to come forward with a story of genuine harm being done because of critical race theory that in any way could outweigh the real threat in our churches of sexual abuse and racism and misogyny and all the other things that are actually harming people.
I found a dead possum in my yard 2 days ago, and I think it was killed by critical race theory.
Had he been
It may have been.
CRT'd?
Yeah.
Either
It's
that
going around.
or by my dog. One or
I'm
the
sorry to
Just
other.
to
hear that.
play
I'm not
devil's
sure.
advocate just a little bit. I think if I have heard some of my friends who are very critical of critical race theory, they're not so much worried about things in the past. They're worried about how it's going to harm things in the future. And so they're sort of
Right.
crying out, that this is going to hurt our culture and our society as a whole, and will have more lasting effects than, these actual tangible wounds of the past.
And fair enough, but there are infinite number of things that can harm me in the future. It's the knife that's actually sticking in my side right now that I think I should be focused on. And in that regard, racism and sexual abuse are a present reality that is harming people and has harmed people for generations in the church that they're ignoring because of a potential hypothetical future threat. And
Okay,
that's what seems kind of ridiculous.
the historian, well-respected historian David Barton. Are you familiar with his work?
Yeah, I would take some of
This
those
is that whole
adjectives
sermon
away,
down
though.
at First Baptist.
Yes,
Yeah.
he's okay. He's not well-respected. He's a Christian historian who's been accused of being somewhat revisionist in his American history to make it extraordinarily conservative Christian in nature. And he spoke recently at Robert Jeffress's First Baptist of Dallas at their, what was it, the Freedom 4th of July
Freedom
Sunday?
Freedom
Freedom Sunday.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and he had a couple of quotes because Sam Perry was live tweeting the message, and one of the quotes was, "Never before in history has America been attacked by so many Americans. Our own citizens are attacking the country like never before in history." And
Who is he referring to?
critical race theorists, the radical left that's attacking.
Not the ones that were actually trying to break into our Capitol, actually physically attacking?
No, And if
You
you're
know how
really
it goes?
talking about all
Civil
of history,
War.
you kind of have to go back to the Civil War. Say, was anyone attacking our citizens? Have our citizens ever attacked our country in a more dramatic way than by saying America has a long history of racism? So how? That's really hard to figure out how to talk to people who have decided, that everything self-critical is an attack on America that must be, defended in the name of Jesus. Tyler, help us out. You don't get to
Yeah,
be here very often. Like you
I
haven't
know.
been here
So I'm
before,
gonna.
right? This is
Well,
your first time.
this is my first time on this podcast. Yeah, and Skye, I've interviewed you a couple of times so Skye and I go way back. I
Wait. You've interviewed Skye?
Yeah, for
yeah
relevant.
yeah.
You've never interviewed me.
Well, well,
What?
you're in luck because I was sent here to ask you to come on Relevance podcast after. So
Okay. Well, now
well,
I'm too hurt. I'm too
we
hurt
can
that you wanted
take care of that off the
to
clock if you
interview
want to.
Skye before you wanted to interview me. I'm too hurt to be on your
Well,
podcast now. Forget about
he's
it.
published through Moody. I've got some Moody connections. It just worked out.
Don't make
It's not. It's
excuses.
all.
Mhm.
It's a and
My
it was a great.
grandmother went to Moody. I dated a Moody girl. I have more Moody
Well,
connections than. Okay, go ahead.
I
What were you saying?
graduated from Moody. I dated a couple Moody girls too.
What? You went to
Uh,
Moody?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Why did you mention that? You went from Nebraska to Moody?
That's right. Yeah,
Those
from
are
Lincoln and then
those are
Moody Bible.
conservative Christian bona fides there.
I think
You're
so.
you're bona fide.
I kind of feel like I can I can translate a little bit. It's giving me a little bit of
Yeah.
a like, oh,
Yeah.
I know what you mean when you say that. I don't know if everybody in the liberal media out there in Hollywood can do quite as the same.
Okay.
Hasn't been spent time in the trenches. So
Yeah.
here's the problem that I've run into with regards to this conversation is when you push back on people who are creating what I would consider to be at least mostly a moral panic around things like critical race theory, which is sort of the one du jour. Um, what when you push back against that, then they immediately go to, well, Jesus said it'd be like this, that we'd be hated for the things we're saying, and we didn't come here to be popular. It's the reality TV thing. We didn't come here to make friends, so of course people are going to say, of course we're going to be criticized, of course we're going to be attacked, and it becomes this self-defeating. You can you go on your auto defenses go up because this is just what happens when you speak the truth, and you're going to get attacked for it. So is there a way to persuasively work around some of those auto defenses in a way that's actually compelling and convincing instead of
Right.
just well, I'm being attacked for being a Christian again. Surprise, surprise.
Right. And I'm wondering if, because I did a race video, it went viral, then and everyone was saying, hey, that was really helpful, thank you. And then all of a sudden someone said, wait a minute, I think you're promoting CRT. And I was like, what the heck is CRT? I've never, and this is more than a year ago. It's like, I'm sorry, I've never heard of it. What am I promoting? Oh, you're Marxist. You're social Marxist. And
Right.
all this like whole new labeling came in, which it charitably, you'd say it's because they were seeing some of the excesses, on the far left. But I don't know if I can be that charitable because we weren't seeing many of those excesses yet. We were upset about rioting, there's been a history of rioting throughout the civil rights movement. So that's not necessarily new. We were upset about rioting, and suddenly all concern about social justice, about racial inequity became labeled as extremist. So it seemed like a method, kind of a convenient method to label all heightened concern about racism as radical and extreme and to be rejected. And I'm just trying to figure out what's the motivation. Why do we
Yeah.
have so much energy about rejecting a call for justice more than we had about actually pursuing justice?
Well, I mean, that's the combination of what you've just said and what Tyler just said. When you put them together, creates a really interesting dynamic where conservative Christians are constantly fabricating new and heightened fears, right? Before CRT, it was Sharia law is taking over. And before that, it was I don't know what, the liberal, they're making all of our children gay, or I don't know what it is, but there's always some heightened paranoia that's out there that are always completely justified. But then whenever there's critique back upon conservative Christian America, it's, well, now we're being persecuted. So critique of others is okay, but critique of the self becomes, victimhood mindset of now we're
Right.
being. So it's this, there's no winning. You can't possibly, it's an impervious barrier where
Right. And you go back to Campus Crusade, and the complaint is, well, you're causing division, you're causing strife within the organization by bringing up, racial history or injustice. So do you really want to cause strife and disunity within the body of Christ? If you don't want to cause strife, don't bring up that stuff.
Then shut up.
Yeah.
Well, and
because you're seen as kind of a traitor.
A troublemaker? I'm not. What are you betraying, though? If you're a traitor, what are you betraying?
The message, I think, there's a party line, and I think it is what is this idea that we are not going to convince people that we're right if we actually have things that we're wrong about. And in fact, I think in this case, there's a sort of a double fear that like, oh, this would mean conceding that like the media got it right before we did, that Hollywood got it right before we did. And so that would be a concession to not only that we did something wrong, but that other people were correct and we were incorrect. So you can't do that.
That's not a good look. We don't like that look.
No, because that's basically saying the enemy was ahead of us on a moral front that we and we have to let them have that. So you can't concede that ground. So you got to get people back on board the message, and the message is first and foremost evangelism, getting out there, preaching the gospel, and there's no part of that can be then given away to any sort of social justice crusade, because then that brings in the world's politics into your own side.
I haven't read the Campus Crusade 179 word page document, whatever it is, critiquing this thing.
What page are you on?
I'm not on page 1. I did read the article about it. Here's the thing, though, like with Cru, they have the added challenge of the fact that that's an institution that, wasn't it launched in the 1950s, right, by Bill Bright?
Yeah.
And, its core document, despite having drifted away from it a little bit, its core document was the 4 spiritual laws, which, though not presented as the gospel, for many people functions synonymously with the gospel.
Right.
And that conception of the gospel is very fundamentalist, very 20th century North American, and it leaves no room for social action, right? It leaves no room for justice. It leaves no room for anything but the individual salvation of souls. And if that's your founding document, and suddenly you find yourself embroiled in all kinds of conversation around social injustice and racism, I can understand why a significant faction of people would be like, hey, this is mission drift.
Right.
Because it doesn't fit with our central cause.
We have our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence. It's this little tract that only has 8 pages.
Right.
And if you go off this, we've given out 48 billion of these and showed the Jesus film 100 million times, and that is what we do.
And the alternative is to say, well, maybe that little 8-page document wasn't all there should be. Maybe that needs to be rethought. And that's a really challenging thing for a 70-year-old organization to do. Yeah. Some folks will be happy to do it, but I'm sure there's other people that are just not ready, and that's not what they signed up for. And that's a real, I sympathize with their dilemma, because I can understand why that's challenging. If you came into the organization going, I'm about sharing the 4 spiritual laws and winning souls to heaven, not changing society and healing racism.
Right. Christian, do you have any last thing you want to ask Tyler before we send him back to his estranged family?
Yeah.
Tyler, how has being on this podcast made you feel?
Oh, man. We're getting back already to the therapy part of it? If I had known, I would have taken more mushrooms before we started.
I'm just
Hey, and we are recording. Okay.
I'm just teasing you. I'm teasing you. You don't have to answer.
I keep it. I do. When the article was brought up a couple of weeks ago, I started hearing from friends I had not heard from in a long time. From Moody friends, people I hadn't talked to since I graduated from college.
Moody friends.
Wow. Started reaching out and telling me about how excited they were. So I hope this is good for my mini fans out there.
And do you have? Okay, Tyler. Last thing, for the average, youngish Christian trying to hang on to their faith, trying to also engage the culture. I mean, what do you have to say to encourage them based on your own experiences as a journalist?
What I keep coming back to is that the world that you're looking for, the community that you're looking for, is bigger than you think it is, and it is there, and it is real, and they love you, and I know it's hard to find, and I know it feels very lonely, but I do believe that God wants all of us to live in community and is actively laboring on your behalf to bring you into community with those people, and I think that you'll be surprised at how quickly that will happen and how encouraging it is when it does.
Hey, that was a good answer.
Thank you.
Where can people follow you, Tyler?
I'm always on Twitter at Tyler Huckabee. Is where you can find me. Don't confuse me for any of the other Huckabees out there. You want to make sure you get this is where the good stuff is, at Tyler Huckabee. And I'm over at relevantmagazine.com, of course, as well. And you'll hear me on the podcast there sometimes. I got my own podcast, my own comic book podcast. It's called Cape Town Pod. If you're a comic book person, you can check that out too.
Ooh, okay. The black sheep of the Huckabee family, Tyler, thanks for joining us on the show this week. We have a guest. Don't go away, listeners. You don't just listen to the first half, you listen to the whole thing, because Skye has a great guest lined up. And thanks, Patreon supporters, for continuing to support us. And also go check out Relevant, because there's really good writing there. And Tyler's doing a bunch of it. Although I just Googled you, I went to the Relevant. While we were talking, I went to the Relevant website. I typed in Tyler Huckabee and nothing came up.
Yeah, well, I don't put my own name in there. I don't do this for the attention.
That might be a problem. Someone might need to talk to IT about that. I wanted to see all your articles. All right. Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks, everybody.
And we'll talk to you next week.
This episode of The Holy Post is being brought to you by With God Daily, the daily devotional I write for people who hate daily devotionals. A lot of people think that the Old Testament God was one of wrath and justice, and the New Testament God that we find in Jesus is one of mercy and compassion. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, when you read the Old Testament, you discover that more often people are upset with God for being too merciful rather than being too wrathful. That's the kind of stuff we're looking at right now in a series we're doing about God's justice, and how we misunderstand it or misapply it, because frankly, sometimes God isn't as angry as we are, or shows compassion to people that we don't think deserve any. And beyond just the theological and biblical themes, we apply it to things going on in our culture right now. If that's the kind of devotional content you're interested in, then I encourage you to go to withgoddaily.com to learn more about how you can sign up to receive the daily devotional 5 days a week in your email, or download the mobile app where you can look at the archives and listen to the audio devotional as well. If you've struggled with devotionals in the past, maybe it's time to try the daily devotional for people who hate daily devotionals. There's no doubt that the last year and a half has been one of upheaval for a lot of us. But even with the pandemic in the rearview mirror, many of us are still facing significant changes. Our churches are adapting to the new post-pandemic reality. Many jobs have changed. Some people are still working from home. Family dynamics and schools are still in flux. How do we navigate all these changes, especially the ones that we didn't anticipate? That's why I was excited to have my guest on today. D. Michael Lindsay has written a new book called Hinge Moments, Making the Most of Life's Transitions. Michael Lindsay was until recently the president of Gordon College, and he's just accepted a new call to be the next president of Taylor University. Both of these institutions are pillars of Christian higher ed. So we talk about the state of higher ed, the very unique challenges facing this younger generation of Christians, as well as Dr. Lindsay's research into leadership and what he's learned about what it means to make really good life decisions and choices when it comes to our careers and vocations. Here's my conversation with Dr. D. Michael Lindsay. Michael Lindsay, welcome to The Holy Post.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So you've written this new book, Hinge Moments, Making the Most of Life's Transitions. And as we were talking about before we started recording, you're in the midst of a transition yourself, which we're going to definitely talk about in a few minutes. But I want to begin with the transition all of us have been in over the last year and a half or so. Early in the book, you cite sociologist Anne Swidler. Is that how you say her name?
Yes.
And she talks about settled and unsettled seasons or times of life. And this past year and a half with COVID-19, for pretty much everybody, has been seriously unsettling.
Hmm.
How did you apply your own research about leadership and transitions as you entered into the pandemic with your family, with Gordon, with your position there? How did it help you figure out what to do in the midst of this chaos?
Well, Swidler is one of the co-authors with Robert Bellah of the classic book from 1984 called Habits of the Heart. And she's a landmark sociologist who has looked at cultural epochs and how we make sense of them. And in many ways, the last year and a half has been the most extraordinary of our lifetimes because if you think about it, 1918 was the Spanish flu pandemic, the biggest public health crisis of the last 100 years. 1929 is the launch of the Great Depression, economic upheaval that has ripple effects, not just in the United States, but around the world. And then 1968 is the year of enormous racial, political, and cultural upheaval. Well, the last year of our life has been like 1918, 1929, and 1968 all rolled into one. So I don't think there's any kind of research or insights aside from the wisdom of God that can really guide us through those kinds of challenges. And yet, we find ourselves now on the cusp of the recovery and moving into that recovery mode. So I certainly have been thinking a lot about how you make the transition from unsettled to settled times and then helping us to figure out how do you do it both personally and professionally.
Okay, so a couple weeks ago on our podcast, we had a conversation. Phil talked about what he called the pipeline, the Christian kid pipeline, where back when he was young, even when I was young, there was a sense of you were kind of born into the church, the nursery, Sunday school, youth group, Christian college or university, and it was possible, as he put it, to go from birth to marriage without having your feet ever touch the secular soil, right? You could just be carried along, and how it feels more and more like that pipeline has been shattered for a lot of churches, a lot of communities. Your career has been in Christian higher ed. You've been the president at Gordon. You're now transitioning to become the president, or maybe you have already been installed as the president at Taylor University in Indiana. So you have a lot of experience in this world. How do you think COVID-19, the pandemic, the economic upheaval, all that stuff has affected Christian higher ed? And not just in a challenging sense, but in a positive sense. Is there any opportunities that are coming out of this unsettling year as you look at higher ed today?
Crisis has a number of ways to open up doors of opportunity. Actually, before I took the job at Gordon, the majority of my professional life had been in secular higher ed at Oxford, Princeton, and Rice. But now I spent 10 years at Gordon, and now I'm excited about this new season at Taylor. What I think is the great opportunity that's before us is that never in our lifetime has the church had the opportunity to demonstrate it can add real value to local communities where we serve because people are desperate for relationship and desperate for community. So much of what we're going to have to do is to figure out how do we meet people where they are. We don't bring to them necessarily preaching the four, spiritual laws, but instead we try to live that out in our community and in the process win them over. I think that there's more spiritual openness than there has been in 25 years. And that's in part because people are longing for connections. They're lonely. They're dealing with mental health crises because they have felt so isolated from one another. And I think you have the economic upheaval and the cultural upheaval on top of that. It just creates a lot of possibilities. So as I assume the Taylor presidency, I'm really interested in figuring out how can Taylor be a blessing, not just to our local community of Upland, but more generally to Indiana and the Midwest. How can we be the kind of community that goes out and tries to make a positive difference in the lives of other folks? We've got a good opportunity. It's our 175th anniversary year. So there's lots of kind of event kinds of things you can do that can be a way of serving folks. I think that that's probably going to be the key for all of us in Christian community is to say, how can we serve our neighbors in new and fresh ways? And I think there's also a greater openness than we've ever seen before because folks have gone through this upheaval and they're longing for connections.
Okay, so I don't know if you remember this, but some years ago I spoke at Gordon when you were president, and getting there was sort of a fiasco because I had been speaking, I think, in Omaha, and I was supposed to fly directly to Boston to speak at Gordon the next couple of days. And storms had disrupted all the flights. It was chaos. I was stuck there, and you and I were on the phone. I don't know how late at night trying to figure out how I was going to get to Boston. And it was some kind of preview weekend or parents weekend or something. And it was really important that you were super helpful in doing that. But one of my memories of that trip was talking to some folks at Gordon. And as I get around the country and I've spoken at a lot of different colleges and universities, I don't know who it was, but somebody told me at Gordon something that has stuck in my head. And I just want to get your feedback on this to see if this is accurate. This was a person who I think I'd been in Christian higher ed for some time. And he or she said to me, years ago, we could assume that if a young person came in as a freshman and had grown up in an evangelical family or gone to a Christian church that was generally evangelical in its approach, that they could come in with the basic framework of a Christian worldview. And then as a higher ed institution, we could kind of build from that as an 18-year-old or whatever. But increasingly, this person said that's no longer the case, that these freshmen are coming in, and in some cases, many cases, they don't have anything that resembles a Christian worldview, which fundamentally changes then what you do in a higher ed institution like a Gordon or maybe a Taylor or a Wheaton where I am here. Is that ring true to you? And how have you been affected by that as you think about the role of Christian higher ed today, given the state of the church and the culture that we're seeing right now?
Well, certainly, if you look at society, most Americans don't know what they believe or why, and are not able to articulate just the most fundamental beliefs about their spiritual sensibilities. But that is certainly true also in the church. People who've grown up in the church, they just don't have fundamental biblical literacy to be able to articulate the narrative of scripture or how it might inform their own sort of approach to dealing with challenges or issues. We've always had the concern that people don't know how to answer the theodicy question of why bad things happen to good people, and how does a loving God who's actively involved in our world allow evil to come into the world. These are timeless questions that I'd say every generation has to grapple with. The difference about the current generation of college students is that they just lack so much of the fundamental understanding of the narrative of Scripture. So one of the things I try to encourage, youth ministers is, while certainly you want to have programming that engages people and helps them, we also need to be able to help them to understand what it is that we believe and why. And it's especially important because far too few of our Christian youth group kids are going to schools like Gordon or Taylor or Wheaton. They're most often going to secular institutions where they're not going to be nurtured in the faith. They're going to be challenged in the faith. And so the need for them to understand what they believe and why is even more important and pressing. I think a couple of issues are affecting us. One is digital media, social media has certainly decreased attention spans. So whereas we used to be comfortable sitting down to read for an hour, now we want to be able to read for 10 minutes and then be done. So things have to be in more bite-sized approaches. And I'd say also the church is still coming to grips with the digital revolution. And so podcasts like yours are fantastic, but not as many people know about them as they should. And so helping more people to be able to take advantage of the technological advances that the church has been a part of to also make it help people to learn their fundamental beliefs, I think is just going to be really important going forward.
Okay, in the book, you talk about how change comes in different forms. There's the change you prepare for that you anticipate. There's the ones that you don't anticipate, they happen to you. And then I think you talk about your family home being flooded when you were young. And then there's change that just devastates you that comes out of nowhere. But our ability to engage those transitions well comes from preparation. And preparation of character and virtue and other things like that. What do you see, whether it's in higher ed or the church or other Christian organizations, what do you see in the best Christian leaders that prepares them for the kinds of challenges and transitions that we're seeing right now? I mean, I've been watching over the last year and a half some friends that I have in different churches around the country, and it's remarkable how different the approaches have been to this pandemic, with some basically hunkering down and saying, we're going to wait this out and we're going to go back to the way it was. And others who are chomping at the bit going, oh, this is a great opportunity. We can finally make some changes that we've been hoping to make, but a crisis gives us that opportunity. Let's take this thing and run with it. What do you look for in a godly leader who is going to face a transition really well versus one who's probably going to buckle?
The surest way to develop virtue in our life is by regular spiritual disciplines. So just as you want to do weightlifting if you want to strengthen your biceps, so also you have to do spiritual weightlifting. And so I oftentimes, when I'm interviewing people to come as faculty candidates or as administrators or staff colleagues, I'll ask them to tell me about what do they do to nurture their faith today? And if they talk about, well, I go to church and I pray on occasion, probably that's not the right person for us, because I'm looking for someone who's actively thinking about, how do I deepen in my faith? So how do I study scripture? How do I deepen in my prayer life? How do I practice fasting and meditation and Sabbath keeping? These become really important crucibles in which our faith is developed. Also, I oftentimes will ask questions about challenges or doubts, because those become important conduits for faith formation. And I think that each of us face, challenges every day that create opportunities for the virtue to be developed more within us. It's interesting because I've actually come convinced that I don't think that necessarily crisis develops character, it just reveals it.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to do the daily habits and practices in our life so that you can develop the character that will sustain you for when the difficult moments come along. And I'm interested in seeing, how do we develop more virtue through the spiritual disciplines, and how do we cultivate those habits of practice in our life so that people will be able to be sustained as the challenges emerge. And the nice thing about the unsettling nature of a pandemic is that it gives you a chance to start new practices, right? To pick up new habits. Now, some of us got into bad habits. We stopped going to the gym. We didn't exercise as much. We ate a little too much. But the recovery creates an opportunity to just press the reset button. And, we're seeing this happen in people's work lives. So folks are saying, maybe I'm not going to commute an hour and a half to work every day. So either I'm going to find a different way to do my work, or I'm going to find a different place to work. Or they also say, I want to do things differently with my family. So I want to have different family routines. We're in the perfect moment for you to pick up new habits, to break bad ones, and to start sort of some new opportunities to develop virtue in your life. In the book, I talk about how, these classical virtues that we would associate with antiquity are certainly very important for us today. Courage and self-control and wisdom and a commitment to justice. These are ways that we live out our spiritual commitments to Christ in the public square. And helping to develop those through spiritual disciplines, I think, is one of the most important things that we can do.
I obviously agree. It's not a popular topic in a lot of our churches. I mean, the thought of discipline or spiritual discipline is not what draws a crowd. It's more entertainment, it's therapeutic sermons, it's things that people enjoy consuming as religious consumers. But the idea of, come and join our community and we will bring more discipline into your life or structure, that's not how you win in a consumeristic marketplace, but it's super needed. Okay, one of the challenges that you articulate in the book is the danger of overcaution or risk aversion. And I thought that little section was really interesting, and the research that you drew on there that shows that people tend to be overly risk averse, very cautious, and for good reason. You get into some of the biological and evolutionary theories behind that, but it made me think of what I've been reading in recent years about my kids' generation and millennials as well. The helicopter parenting that goes on, the secular talk of safe spaces, which kind of mirrors a lot of what you hear in evangelical communities about creating safe environments for the whole family and avoiding pain and struggle and risk. There have been others who've talked about the essential quality of grit, that perseverance, the willingness to take risks and learn and grow from them. You've been in higher ed now for a long time. You've worked with a lot of young people. What do you see in this younger generation, good and bad, that either encourages you or makes you worried a little bit about this ability to overcome over caution and fear and this desire to be safe all the time if they're really going to grow through these transitions?
Well, all of us know that if you look back over your life and you can see the moments of tremendous growth, they were oftentimes in seasons of great peril. So one of the key things that I try to do in the book is just tell stories. And actually, I'd say, Skye, your comment about how we're in a consumeristic kind of culture in the church, we are, and yet we're really drawn to stories. And evangelicals tell stories better than most other Christian communities. And so using story as a way of sort of inspiring people, I think, is fundamental to helping them to see spiritual discipline and virtue can be exciting and worth pursuing. And I think that what I try to do in the book is to tell the story of people who are willing to take risks. So, One of the people I was super impressed with out of my interviews was Condoleezza Rice. Incredibly impressive woman, super bright. She was the youngest provost at Stanford, eventually served as our national security advisor and secretary of state. She's wickedly smart, deeply committed to Jesus. And I was curious about her own journey. And if you know her story, you know that she grew up in the segregated Jim Crow era of Birmingham, Alabama. And her parents thought that she was going to be a classically trained concert pianist. And she pursued that with great vigor and joy and thought she was going to do that till she went to a Van Cliburn competition where she was playing. I think she was 14 years old. And she realized that there was another pianist who was playing the exact same piece. She had been practicing it for a year. He had practiced it for a few weeks. And she said, I just realized I will never be as good as that kid. And he's just one of thousands of kids that are trying to make it as a classically trained concert pianist. And she recognized at that moment, I've got to pursue a different passion if I'm going to change things. Now, as a 14-year-old, you might think, well, she had her whole life in front of her, but she had dedicated thousands of hours to becoming a concert pianist. And so it is for you and for me, right? We've spent thousands of hours thinking we're going to do a certain job, but eventually you might reach the end of that road and recognize God's got something else in store for you. And so that can be a very upsetting process. And how you respond in the moment says a lot about the kind of character that you developed and the virtue over the long haul. What I try to do in the book is to tell the stories of people like Condi Rice, who actually were willing to say, I'm willing to take a risk. And to, in the process of that, sort of encourage the reader to say, maybe there's a risk that is worth taking because the research shows you are far more likely to gain on the upside than you are to be disadvantaged in the downside when you're willing to take the risk.
Yeah, first of all, the stories in the book are fantastic. I mean, some of them are familiar stories of people you know, like Condi Rice or Oprah Winfrey. Francis Collins, the story you kind of open the book with, is a great one. But you also tell stories of people that I didn't know as much about, like the former CEO of Alaska Airlines. I forget his name.
Yeah.
Um, Folks like that inspiring people who inspired you as well, who decided
Yeah.
preemptively, more or less, to say, "Hey, I'm done here. I'm going to deliberately seek a transition, not knowing what's next." And as somebody, I tend to not be very risk averse. I like change. I like upheaval. It doesn't throw me off. But I'm certainly surrounded by people who do avoid risk and change. And so it's good to have some of those stories embedded in there of people who are willing to jump out and try things. Toward that end, in my informal counseling of college students over the years, um, one of the things I've noticed is that they get really bent out of shape of making these decisions, especially when they're approaching graduation and they're like, oh, what am I really going to do with my life now? Um, it, it strikes me that we put so much value and significance in our vocation. And part of that can be healthy and good. I mean, you talk in the book about the danger of a sacred secular divide that severely limits our imaginations of what God wants to do through us. So that's a good side of valuing vocation. But on the flip side, when we make it into an idol, when we put all of our value and significance into it, it makes those transitions when they occur without our knowing them or anticipating them just absolutely devastating. And this came home to me years ago when I was training as a hospital chaplain. And one of the things I had to be trained in was suicide counseling. And I didn't realize this at the time, but learned that suicide was most common among the elderly, and explaining that it's because they have lost one vocation after another. That's the process of aging, whether it's your actual job or a relationship or a spouse or family or physical abilities. As those things deteriorate over time, your sense of value and purpose can also disappear. And then suicide sadly becomes a thoughtful option for some people. All that to say, how do you at the same time counsel people on the value and importance of these transitions without succumbing to the despair and the idolatrous clinging to the past or an identity or a vocation? What's the balance there, and how have you helped counsel people through that?
Well, careerism is most certainly one of the besetting sins of the evangelical church. And so, how much identity we place in what we do and how we evaluate our own relative merit based upon what our title is or sphere of influence becomes, one of those things that I think the Lord really calls us to judgment on. I think it's important for college students to take the job search process seriously and to actively look for something that could be meaningful. But I think we attach too much of our identity to our happiness in our job, especially early on. So much of what you have to do is just apply design kind of thinking to your own sense of vocation, and it's a matter of trial and error, right? I mean, I don't know how it was for you, Skye, but for me, I really didn't discover my joy for what I'm doing in my career until I tried out several different things along the way. I needed to have a little of experimentation. And there's parts of my job as a college president that I love doing, and there's parts of my job that I don't love doing. And yet you can still be passionate about something, but not love every minute of your job. And I think most 22-year-olds are expecting to find a job that they're going to love every single minute. I don't think that exists. And I certainly don't think it exists for an entry level position. I think you got to sort of be willing to say, okay, in the beginning, you have to just sort of learn what it is to work in an organization and to be a contributing member of a team. And those will be important sort of skills. When I was finishing up at college, I thought I was going straight to seminary. My senior year of seminary, the place where I thought I was going, they had a real fight between the board of trustees and the president. And it turns out that the board fired the president, and the newspapers reported that they locked him out of his office. And I remember I drove home 8 hours to go see my home pastor because I was so upset that a seminary would lock their president out of his office and just sort of cast him aside so quickly. And he said, maybe you ought to just take a couple of years and work in the everyday private sector like everybody else does and get a feel for things. I'm so glad I did that because it had a way of sort of helping me to just learn what it is to be a member of a regular team working at a job, but also it had a way of relativizing my ideals of what work should be and helped me to see, for a lot of us, it's a matter of having a place where you can make a contribution, but the contribution is not going to change the world every single day. So I think part of it is saying, yeah, you need to apply some intentionality to thinking about something. And at the same time, let's not make an idol of it because that becomes really problematic in the long haul.
Yeah, I mean that gets to something I've heard from a number of young people. And I don't know if this is a Christian thing or it's just a broader issue, but some of them carry this very linear vision of what their life is supposed to be. They have it all plotted out, and they think it's going to go from A to B to C all the way to Z, and invariably something happens that disrupts that plan, and then they catastrophize the whole thing, and they think, oh, that God's plan for my life is some kind of highway, and I am supposed to know exactly which exits to take, when to take them, and it all is going to be laid out clean and almost hygienic. You talk about Dave Evans in the book, who was one of the founders of EA, and a course that he teaches about kind of life planning stuff, and he mentions the Odyssey plan, which I thought was really interesting, which gets a little bit of what you're talking about here in simultaneously holding out multiple options for yourself rather than this one definitive, it has to be this way. Can you explain what that is and how it works practically?
So Dave Evans, who's a wonderful Christ follower, teaches design thinking at Stanford. And Dave says that probably the best thing for you to do is to envision 3 different kinds of futures for your life and not think about it in terms of 30 years, but just in terms of 5 years, a 5-year plan where one of those options is you sort of take additional steps down the same pathway that you're pursuing. Another is that you make a right angle turn, but you can see some continuity with what you're doing. And then another is completely out of the blue, where if money and location was no object, what would you be doing 5 years from now? And pursuing those 3 ideas with equal kinds of deliberation and consideration and discernment becomes a really important way for you to begin to think about, okay, well, what could the Lord do and how might he open up doors of possibility? I could never dream that I would be a university president. Certainly never dreamed I'd be at Gordon in Boston. I'm from Mississippi, so I thought people from Massachusetts talk really funny. And the idea of living in a place where they have snow scared me to death. But lo and behold, I've been here for 10 years. So then at the end of this, I thought naturally the Lord was going to call me back south. Maybe I'd be in Texas or something. The idea of going to Indiana was very foreign, but that's exactly what God has done. In each of the critical turning points of my life, the hinge moments that I've experienced, the Lord has spoken to me in very powerful ways. And so, I find that the Lord will speak to us in dramatic moments. For some of my friends from Africa, it comes in the form of a dream. I've never had God speak to me a dream, but I've really asked him to. Instead, it's really come in the form of dramatic prayers, speaking to me through particular moments. My own decision to go to Taylor after having this time at Gordon really came through a sleepless night. One that I was, actively trying to fall asleep and tried all these different things. And the Lord just would not let me go, kind of like Jacob wrestling with an angel of the Lord. And, I'm 49 years old and I had never had a sleepless night before that evening or since that evening. But that became a really important way that God spoke to me. I don't know how it is in your life, but generally speaking, I find that God speaks to us in the same way he's spoken to us in the past. Maybe it's through sermons or through a podcast or through reading a great book. But I find that the Lord uses those as conduits to be able to communicate to us what he wants us to do. And part of it is by being genuinely open through that Odyssey plan to three different pathways and saying, okay, God, what do you want to do in my life?
Yeah, I'm certainly not doing what I anticipated 20 years ago, and the road has been very nonlinear. I I quit Christianity Today 3 times, and kept getting pulled back in, and it was a very uncertain dynamic for many years of what I was doing and why I was doing it, and all these things. Yeah, I never would have predicted it at all. Uh, Getting back to your story and transitions a little bit, did you have a sense of certainty when you made these leaps? I mean, you talk about your first decision to put your name in the hat for the president at Gordon and the circumstances surrounding that, which are pretty dramatic and almost frightening. And then this more recent decision to resign your role at Gordon, not knowing where you were going to go after that, and now you've landed at Taylor. But when you made those decisions, was there a sense of certainty, like I know this is what I'm supposed to do, or was it more tenuous? Was it more ambiguous for you about I don't know if this is the right thing? And how do you, like, so many people want that absolute assurance? I know this is what God is telling me to do. I had the dream, the lightning bolt moment, the fleece was laid out, all that. But in my experience, I've not had that in
Yeah.
most cases. So
Yeah.
what about you? What does that meant? Like, how do you step into the ambiguity with a sense of this is still what I'm supposed to do?
Well, the challenge is that you have to live life going forward, but you really only understand it by looking backward.
Right.
So I can look back and I have great certainty that the Lord definitely was guiding me at critical hinge moments. But in the messiness of the moment, I didn't have that certainty. The decision to step down from Gordon was really one that I considered for over a year. And it started when Arthur Brooks came to speak at Gordon. Arthur had been the wildly successful president of the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a very devout Catholic. And he came and spoke at a Gordon event and described his own sense that after 10 years of heading up AEI, it was time for him to do something different. And as he spoke, I had these butterflies in my stomach. And I got home that night and I said to my wife, why am I so nervous for Arthur Brooks? Like, he's made his decision. So why am I upset? And she said, well, maybe you're wondering if God is calling you to do something similar. And that was a very unsettling comment from my wife because I was not thinking that way. Rebecca began saying, I just wonder if maybe after 10 years, the Lord wants you to do something different. The reason I didn't like that is because I saw it as a lot of loss. I had worked really hard for 10 years. Gordon was like a flywheel that was turning, and I had been working on it for a while. And I finally felt like our 7 years of plenty were finally coming to the institution, and I wanted to enjoy those. It took several more months, and I was working on this book, and I was rereading all of these 550 interviews I had done, and I happened upon this one that you mentioned with Bruce Kennedy, who was the CEO of Alaska Airlines. And I had long forgotten that in the interview, he had told me about his decision to step down from the job at Alaska after 10 years on the job. And as my eyes went across the page as I was reading that transcript, I got those butterflies back immediately again that I'd had with Arthur Brooks. And I remember I put the paper down and I thought, no, Lord, what's going on here? Are you trying to say something about 10 years? I had some conversations with my board at Gordon, and they were wonderful and said, you just need a break. And, let's put that on hold. And then the pandemic happened. And that really did cause us to say, we got to really, I need to be here. The institution really needs a strong, stable leadership. So we put those on hold. But then last summer, I could see that the college was going to emerge in a recovery and we were going to be okay. And I'll never forget last July, I took my senior leadership team to a retreat out in New Hampshire in the White Mountains. And we were having our final farewell dinner and the sun was setting. It was a beautiful July evening and we'd invited their spouses to come. And so there was, about 20, 25 people there. And I was sort of standing over the group as everybody was saying affirming words to one another. And I just had this very strong sense from God. This is the best leadership team Gordon has ever had. And they are very talented. It's okay to pass the baton. And I had this huge lump in my throat because I just sensed God was saying to me, it's okay for you to step away. It still took a little while longer. My wife and I went the week of Labor Day, we went to Nantucket. And her parents came up to help watch the girls. And we took a lot of long walks to pray and to think. And by the end of that week, I had really reached a sense that God was indeed calling me to be willing to step aside from the Gordon presidency. And I really had no idea what I might be going to next. He used the next month or so to give me some additional confirmations so I didn't lose my nerve. But even in that moment, when I told the board of Gordon, and I mean, I was getting text messages and phone calls, and they were saying, I really think that you just need a little bit of a break, but, we really think that you should stay on. I was beginning to feel a sense of confirmation that as scary as it was, this was the right thing to do. And I remember I ended the Zoom meeting with my board where I had basically made this decision. And they were, some people were trying to persuade me otherwise. And I just said, in my heart, I think really this is what God has called me to do. I think the most appropriate thing for me at this point is to say, I'm very grateful for your support. I love Gordon. I'm going to give it my very best for this next year. But I think it's now time for you all to begin to think about how you would search for my successor. So I'm going to log off and give you all some time to do that. And we'll have some follow-up conversation in the weeks ahead. And so I did. And my wife was in the room where I said that. We went and got Chick-fil-A and some ice cream after that. And it was the beginning of a new chapter for us. And it was an odyssey because I didn't really know what to do. So I called Arthur Brooks and said, what do I do now? And he said, well, we Catholics, we'll go to mass every day. I don't know what you evangelical Protestants do, but I think you need to sort of find a way to mark this season to say, God, I really want to be guided by you. And so Rebecca and I decided that every day we would take a walk that we called a discernment walk, and we would pray aloud and ask the Lord to guide us. And we meditated on one passage of scripture, which was Psalm 37. You're probably familiar with the most famous verse from that, delight yourself in the Lord, and he'll give you the desires of your heart. But if you read the totality of the Psalm, it's really known as the Meekness Psalm. This is the Psalm that Jesus alludes to in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And a meekness psalm is not exactly what you want to be meditating on in the season when you're applying for jobs, trying to get something new. But actually, the Lord used it as a way to sort of just remind me he is in control and he will guide our steps. And for about 6 months, Rebecca and I would take a walk every day. And, every day meant sometimes it was in the morning, walking along the beach when it was beautiful and sunny. And other times we didn't get a chance to take a walk until 10 o'clock at night after our kids were in bed and it was snowing and it was dark and we're walking in the New England winter. But we did that as a way of saying, God, we really want you to guide us in this season. And I am here to bear witness that the Lord used those discernment walks to begin to sort of guide and direct us, open up doors of possibility. I was very blessed. I have 3 different pathways that I could pursue. And I am going to tailor with great joy and excitement because it's where the Lord has called me. And For those folks, for those listeners who are still trying to say, God, what do you want in my life? I will just say, as we open ourselves up to his guidance, he will lead us sometimes to very scary places, but he always guides us to a place of new service and meaningful opportunity. And if the Lord can do it in my life, he can also do it in yours.
Thank you for sharing that in such detail, because I have no doubt a lot of people listening to this are facing transitions. Given that we're coming out of this pandemic, a lot of organizations and jobs are changing, and people may have that angst that you felt a year ago about, is this the time? A couple of things that stood out to me, though, about your story, which highlight the very things you talk about in the book and the importance of these disciplines that you talked about cultivating in advance of a transition. First of all, you sought the input and advice of others. Your wife, most intimately, obviously, through those walks every day, but Arthur Brooks, members of your board, like you sought really wise counsel in that, which was important in every transition I've ever made as well. Obviously, you had the discipline of prayer. Psalm 37, those times of just reflection and meditation on the Lord's leading that no doubt helped you make the decision to go to Taylor, but you stepped into that not knowing what the future was, which a lot of people want it all figured out before they make the step, which is a sign of faith and courage. But the third one, which isn't explicit in the story but implied, you obviously had a significant sense of self-awareness that even as you read Arthur Brooks or heard him talk, or then and read Kennedy's story of his transition out of Alaska Airlines, like you had this self-awareness enough to know what was inside of you. And for me, again, as I speak to young people, that's the part that I think they get hung up on the most. And I don't want to get on my soapbox here about cell phones again, but I feel like for my own kids who are teenagers and college students now, high school and college students, their ability to be self-aware of what's really going on inside of them is hindered by their constant engagement with external stimulation. They're never bored. And when they're never bored, they don't know what's really inside of them. And so putting away the phones, the devices, and creating space to just know what is in me so that I have something to go to God in prayer about, so that I can go to, if you're married, a spouse and say, hey, maybe 10 years is up and I should be transitioning out here. You can't even get to that point, though, if you're constantly externally distracted. So all that to say, I hope that people listening to this will apply this to where they're at and just begin with what's really in me and what desires or fears or callings do I sense the Lord putting in me that I may not be aware of because I'm too stinking distracted all the time. Okay, last thing I want to ask you about before we go. You have this really interesting quote, page 42, by Hugo Hecklo. Is that his name?
Hugh Hecklo, yeah.
Hugh Hecklo, political scientist. He says, current decisions are made with a continuing awareness that you are enjoying the fruits of something belonging to predecessors and successors. Therefore, while change is inevitable, the recognition of its implications is embedded in a strong appreciation for what has gone on before you were here and what will go on after you are gone. This is in a section where you talk about the importance of institutions. At the same time, as you cite, our belief in institutions, our commitment to and trust in institutions is at an all-time low. So as an institutional leader of now 2 Christian colleges, how do we think about this going forward? I mean, so many young people, the statistics show, are leaving the institutional church. They have less faith than ever in government, in business, in higher ed. Is this an inevitable trend of the future, or can it be arrested and changed? And without that institutional support, are we just left to be a society of constant independent entrepreneurship? There's a value to that, but it's a little frightening as well for those of us who believe that institutions do have a critical role in our formation.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about the current moment is that there's so much entrepreneurial energy around the world. And yet, every entrepreneur, if they are successful, build great institutions. So, institutions are inevitable and they're becoming more pervasive and more powerful than they ever have been before because they've consolidated power and there's more a wider reach. So Starbucks not only shapes, your taste in coffee, but it also shapes the way you think about time and space. So these kinds of institutions have an outsized influence on our life. So those of us in the church rightly understand institutions really matter. And so we want to make sure that they're Christ followers who are serving in major institutions, but also that we're creating a healthy appreciation for the great value the institutions can bring. Throughout church history, it's been institutions that have been some of the most important carriers of the gospel, to be perfectly honest. Of course, it occurs through the embodied stories of individuals, but each of us, we really make the biggest difference when we are able to tether our work to somebody else and join in community to get things done. So I'm a big believer in institutions. Obviously, institutions disappoint us, and as one who is leaving an institution, I have a keen appreciation for how institutions, in the end, they move on even when you're not ready to move on. And so some of it is that you just have to be reminded that institutions are primarily vehicles for relationship building, that they are the power lines in which the energy flows and allows you to sort of develop those meaningful relationships. And you take those relationships with you wherever you are because you are nurtured and developed in those. And so Hecklo is a big believer. He wrote a book called On Thinking Institutionally. And he's trying to encourage thoughtful people to say, I got to pay attention to institutions because they have an outsized impact on how I actually make a difference in the wider world. And so it is for you and for me, that we take the kind of transforming work that the gospel has done on our individual heart, but that we're able to work together to build institutions through podcasts or through publications or through universities or through our work, that these become ways in which we actually get things done, not just for the gospel of God, but also for the common good.
Well, Michael, Lindsay, thank you for your work in these institutions and blessings as you begin at Taylor. It's a great place. I've been there many times, have friends there. And thank you for the work you've done in your books, your latest Hinge Moments, making the most of life's transitions. I didn't talk specifically about it, but it's a really accessible book, a lot of stories. It's not a long book, and it's a great one for anybody, young person, older person, who is thinking of a change or facing a change. There's just a lot of practical wisdom in it and great inspiring stories, which, as you said, it's really what helps us get through it. Thank you so much for being on The Holy Post.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Skye Pilot Media, that's Skye's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/holypost. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.